All right. Welcome back again for our reading of the Scarlet Letter. Today we're reading chapter 8, and it leaves off right where, or begins right where chapter 7 left off. So at the end of chapter 7, Hester and Pearl were at Governor Bellingham's house, mansion, hall, whatever you want to call it. Pearl had just had a fit because she wants a rose from his garden. And then she lets out this blood-curdling scream, and then as the guys walk up, she goes silent. So as chapter 8 opens up, it's called The Elf Child and the Minister. The elf child, of course, would be referring to Pearl. And the Governor Bellingham and the other guys have just gotten to the house. So at the beginning here, it's just talking about some of that hypocrisy that Hawthorne keeps shoving in our face, where the governor is giving a tour of his property and kind of bragging like, oh, look what I have here, and oh, we have plans for this over here, these projects that we have coming up, things that really aren't supposed to be important to the Puritans, and yet they are. So they'll preach that we shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that, but then they themselves don't really follow it. So major hypocrites. Governor Bellingham, in a loose gown and easy cap, such as elderly gentlemen love to undo themselves with in their domestic privacy, walked foremost and appeared to be showing off his estate and expatiating on his projected improvements. The wide circumference of an elaborate ruff, beneath his gray beard in the antiquated fashion of King James's reign, caused his head to look not a little like that of John the Baptist in a charger. So this is not important, but if you've looked at old pictures from like Elizabethan England, they would have these big fancy like ruffles all the way around like at their collar. It just sticks straight out. So Governor Bellingham has one of those on, and it kind of makes it look like his head on a platter, like John the Baptist. The impression made by his aspect, so rigid and severe and frost-bitten with more than autumnal age, was hardly in keeping with the appliances of worldly enjoyment wherewith he had evidently done his utmost to surround himself. So he himself looks really old-fashioned, and yet he has all these nice things around him, more modern things. But it is an error to suppose that our grave forefathers, though accustomed to speak and think of human existence as a state merely of trial and warfare, and though unfeignedly prepared to sacrifice goods and life at the behest of duty, made it a matter of conscience to reject such means of comfort or even luxury as lay fairly within their grasp. This creed was never taught, for instance, by the venerable pastor John Wilson, whose beard, white as a snowdrift, was seen over Governor Bellingham's shoulder, while its wearer suggested that pears and peaches might yet be naturalized in the New England climate, and that purple grapes might possibly be compelled to flourish against the sunny garden wall. The old clergyman, nurtured at the rich bosom of the English church, had a long established and legitimate taste for all good and comfortable things, and however stern he might show himself in the pulpit or in his public reproof of such transgressions as that of Hester Prynne, still the genial benevolence of his private life had won him warmer affection than was accorded to any of his professional contemporaries. So far we know two of the guys who are here. We have Governor Bellingham and we have Reverend Wilson. That's the older Reverend. And it just tells us again that he might have been very stern, but he was very well liked. He had earned the warm affections of his of the people. Behind the governor and Mr. Wilson came two other guests. One, the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, whom the reader may remember as having taken a brief and reluctant part in the scene of Hester Prynne's disgrace, and in close companionship with him, old Roger Chillingworth, a person of great skill in physic, who for 2 or 3 years past had been settled in the town. It was understood that this learned man was the physician as well as friend of the young minister, whose health had severely suffered of late by his too unreserved self-sacrifice to the labors and duties of the pastoral relation. So, in addition to Bellingham and Wilson, we also have Reverend Arthur Dimsdale and Roger Chillingworth. And it says that Chillingworth is there as Dimsdale's doctor and friend because Dimsdale's health has been like going downhill the last 2 or 3 years because he works too hard. The governor, in advance of his visitors, ascended 1 or 2 steps and, throwing open the leaves of the great hall window, found himself close to little Pearl. The shadow of the curtain fell on Hester Prynne and partially concealed her. So when it talks about the hall window in this chapter, don't think of it like a window. Think of it more like a French door. So this is common in literature, older literature, where I don't know why. I don't know why. But when it talks about them coming in and out of the window, think of it like a big door that's got lots of glass. So they're not crawling through the window. When they get to the house, to the door here, they see Pearl standing inside. And that's all they can see because Hester is like off to the side and the curtains, or the shadow of the curtains, is kind of hiding her. "What have we here?" said Governor Bellingham, looking with surprise at the scarlet little figure before him. "I profess I've never seen the like since my days of vanity in old King James's time, when I was wont to esteem it a high favor to be admitted to a court masque. There used to be a swarm of these small apparitions in holiday time, and we called them children of the Lord of Misrule. But how got such a guest into my hall?" "Ay, indeed," cried good old Mr. Wilson. "What little bird of scarlet plumage may this be? Methinks I've seen just such figures, when the sun has been shining through a richly painted window, and tracing out the golden and crimson images across the floor. But that was in the old land. Prithee, young one, who art thou, and what has ailed thy mother to bedizen thee in this strange fashion? Art thou a Christian child, huh? Dost know thy catechism? Or art thou one of those naughty elves or fairies whom we thought to have left behind us with other relics of papistry in merry old England?" "I am mother's child," answered the scarlet vision, "and my name is Pearl." Okay, so when they come in, my personal opinion, I think this is a little bit of a hole that Hawthorne maybe didn't catch. So when these guys come in and they see Pearl standing there, and she's dressed in her fancy red and gold dress, they don't recognize her, which I find odd considering they're so concerned about her custody, and Hester is such a well-known, infamous person, if you will, in this colony, which might have had 1,000 people. I don't know exactly how many. But I don't think that they wouldn't have not reckoned I don't think they would have not recognized her, but that's how it's written. So they're asking, like, "Oh, you look like you're ready for a ball, like a masquerade." And Wilson says, "Who are you, and why on earth has your mother dressed you this way?" Then he asks if she knows thy catechism, which was like a set of Christian beliefs or lessons, I don't really know what to call them, that they learned from an early age. And it was like, I don't know what to compare it to. They were set up like question and answer, apparently. So they'd quiz them and they were supposed to know this is response, is like a call and response kind of thing. So she says, "My name's Pearl." "Pearl? Ruby rather, or coral, or red rose at the very least, judging from thy hue," responded the old minister, putting forth his hand in a vain attempt to pat little Pearl on the cheek. "But where is this mother of thine?" "Ah, I see," he added, and turning to Governor Bellingham, whispered, "This is the self-same child of whom we have held speech together, and behold here the unhappy woman, Hester Prynne, her mother." "Sayest thou so?" cried the governor. "Nay, we might have judged that such a child's mother must needs be a scarlet woman, and a worthy type of her of Babylon. But she comes at a good time, and we will look into this matter forthwith." So when Bellingham's told who it is by Wilson, he says, "Well, we should have known that a kid like this must belong to a woman like her, like a scarlet woman, like a not very well respected. We'll just leave it at that. It's kind of like calling her a hussy. Governor Bellingham stepped through the window into the hall and followed by his sorry. He stepped through the window into the hall followed by his three guests. Hester Prynne, said he, fixing his naturally stern regard on the wearer of the Scarlet Letter, there hath been much question concerning thee of late. The point hath been weightily discussed whether we that are of authority and influence do well discharge our consciences by trusting an immortal soul, such as there is in yonder child, to the guidance of one who hath stumbled and fallen amid the pitfalls of this world. Speak thou, the child's own mother. Were it not, thinkest thou, for thy little one's temporal and eternal welfare, that she be taken out of thy charge, and clad soberly, and disciplined strictly, and instructed in the truths of heaven and earth? What canst thou do for the child in this kind? So he says, you know, Hester, we leaders have been talking about whether it's right to leave a child who has an immortal soul, right, in your charge, a sinful woman. Because don't you think she would be better off with people who would dress her appropriately and discipline her strictly and teach her correctly? And then he says to her, well, what can you do on those grounds? And she says, I can teach my little Pearl what I've learned from this, answered Hester Prynne, laying her finger on the red token. Woman, it is thy badge of shame, replied the stern magistrate. It is because of the stain which that letter indicates that we would transfer thy child to other hands. Nevertheless, said the mother, calmly, though growing more pale, this badge hath taught me, it daily teaches me, it is teaching me at this moment, lessons whereof my child may be the wiser and better, albeit they can profit nothing to myself. We will judge warily, said Bellingham, and look well what we are about to do. Good Master Wilson, I pray you, examine this Pearl, since that is her name, and see whether she hath had such Christian nurture as befits a child of her age. The old minister seated himself in an armchair and made an effort to draw Pearl betwixt his knees. But the child, unaccustomed to the touch of familiarity of any but her mother, escaped through the open window and stood on the upper step, looking like a wild tropical bird of rich plumage, ready to take flight into the upper air. Mr. Wilson, not a little astonished at this outbreak, for he was a grandfatherly sort of personage and usually a vast favorite with children, essayed, however, to proceed with the examination. So what they're doing here is Governor Bellingham tells Wilson that he needs to examine her. And when he says examine her, he means like see if she knows all of the religious stuff that a kid her age should know, the catechism that I was talking about. Wilson sits down and he tries to like pull Pearl towards him to like stand right here in front of him. Maybe he puts his hands on her shoulders or something. But before he has a chance, she is gone. She takes off. She stands right outside the room. Why does she do this? The narrator says it's because she is not used to anyone trying to get close to her or touch her other than her mother. And so it kind of weirds her out. Pearl, said he with great solemnity, thou must take heed to instruction that so in due season thou mayest wear in thy bosom the pearl of great price. Canst thou tell me, child, who made thee? Now Pearl well knew enough who made her. For Hester Prynne, the daughter of a pious home, very soon after her talk with the child about her heavenly Father, had begun to inform her of those truths which the human spirit, at whatever stage of immaturity, imbibes with such eager interest. Pearl, therefore, so large were the attainments of her 3 years' lifetime, could have borne a fair examination in the New England Primer, or the first column of the Westminster Catechisms, although unacquainted with the outward form of either of these celebrated works. Okay, so the question that Wilson poses is, who made you? Do you know who made you? The correct response should be, of course, My heavenly Father made me. If you'll remember earlier in the book, she and Hester had that exact exchange. The problem is, Pearl, it tells us here, is 3 years old now, and 3-year-olds aren't super cooperative. So Hester has taught her these things. Even though she doesn't have like the actual books that she's teaching her from, Hester came up in a good family, a good household, and she remembers the things she learned as a kid, and so she's teaching these things to Pearl. She knows the right answer, but it doesn't want to give it, I guess. The book reads, "But that perversity which all children have more or less of, and of which little Pearl had a tenfold portion, now at the most inopportune moment took thorough possession of her and closed her lips, or impelled her to speak words amiss. After putting her finger in her mouth with many ungracious refusals to answer good Mr. Wilson's questions, the child finally announced that she had not been made at all, but had been plucked by her mother off the bush of wild roses that grew by the prison door." This fantasy was probably suggested by the near proximity of the governor's red roses, as Pearl stood outside of the window, together with her recollection of the prison rose bush which she had passed in coming hither. Old Roger Chillingworth, with a smile on his face, whispered something in the young clergyman's ear. Hester Prynne looked at the man of skill, even then with her fate hanging in the balance, was startled to perceive what a change had come over his features, how much uglier they were, how his dark complexion seemed to have grown duskier, and his figure more misshapen, since the days when she had familiarly known him. She met his eyes for an instant, but was immediately constrained to give all her attention to the scene now going forward. So, this will be mentioned again later. Hester, as she's standing there in the middle of this chaos, because it kind of is chaotic, she catches a glimpse or eye contact for just a minute with Roger Chillingworth. Now, remember, this is her husband, her secret husband, right? Because nobody else knows. And she can't get over how awful he looks. It says he's uglier, his complexion is duskier, and he's even more misshapen. She only thinks about it for a moment, though, before her attention is brought back to the current scene. "This is awful," cried the governor, slowly recovering from the astonishment into which Pearl's response had thrown him. "Here is a child of 3 years old, and she cannot tell who made her. Without question, she is equally in the dark as to her soul, its present depravity, and future destiny. Methinks, gentlemen, we need inquire no further." Hester caught hold of Pearl and drew her forcibly into her arms, confronting the old Puritan magistrate with almost a fierce expression. Alone in the world, cast off by it, and with this sole treasure to keep her heart alive, she felt that she possessed indefeasible rights against the world and was ready to defend them to the death. "God gave me the child," cried she. "He gave her in requital of all things else which he had taken from me. She is my happiness. She is my torture nonetheless. Pearl keeps me here in life. Pearl punishes me too. See ye not, she is the Scarlet Letter, only capable of being loved, and so endowed with 1,000,000-fold the power of retribution for my sin. Ye shall not take her. I will die first." "My poor woman," said the not unkind old minister, "the child shall be well cared for, far better than thou canst do it." "God gave her into my keeping," repeated Hester Prynne, raising her voice almost to a shriek. "I will not give her up." And here, by a sudden impulse, she turned to the young clergyman, Mr. Dimmesdale, at whom, up to this moment, she had seemed hardly so much as once to direct her eyes. "Speak thou for me," cried she. "Thou wast my pastor, and hadst charge of my soul, and knowest me better than these men can. I will not lose the child. Speak for me. Thou knowest, for thou hast sympathies which these men lack. Thou knowest what is in my heart, and what are a mother's rights, and how much the stronger they are when the mother has but her child and the Scarlet Letter. Look thou to it. I will not lose the child. Look to it." At this wild and singular appeal, which indicated that Hester Prynne's situation had provoked her to little less than madness, The young minister at once came forward, pale and holding his hand over his heart, as was his custom whenever his peculiarly nervous temperament was thrown into agitation. He looked now more careworn and emaciated than as we described him at the scene of Hester's public ignominy. And whether it were his failing health or whatever the cause might be, his large dark eyes had a world of pain in their troubled and melancholy depth. "There's truth in what she says," began the minister, with a voice sweet and tremulous, but powerful, insomuch that the hall re-echoed and the hollow armor rang with it. "The truth in what Hester says and in the feeling which inspires her. God gave her the child, and gave her, too, an instinctive knowledge of its nature and requirements, both seemingly so peculiar, which no other mortal being can possess. And moreover, is there not a quality of awful sacredness in the relation between this mother and this child?" So Dimsdale, upon Hester's request, because she's like, "You know me, you're my pastor, tell them that I should get to keep this child." So he does. He stands up and he says, she's right. God gave her the child, and that means God gave her the ability to take care of the child, know what the child needs. How is that, good Master Dimsdale?" interrupted the governor. "Make that plain, I pray you." "It must be even so," resumed the minister, "for if we deem it otherwise, do we not thereby say that the Heavenly Father, the Creator of all flesh, hath lightly recognized a deed of sin, and made of no account the distinction between unhallowed lust and holy love? This child, of its father's guilt and its mother's shame, hath come from the hand of God to work in many ways upon her heart, who pleads so earnestly and with such bitterness of spirit the right to keep her. It was meant for a blessing, for the one blessing of her life. It was meant, doubtless, as the mother herself hath told us, for a retribution too, a torture to be felt at many an unthought of moment, a pang, a sting, an ever-recurring agony in the midst of a troubled joy. Hath she not expressed this thought in the garb of the poor child, so forcibly reminding us of that red symbol which sears her bosom?" "Well said again," cried good Mr. Wilson. "I feared the woman had no better thought than to make a mountebank of her child." "Oh, not so, not so," continued Mr. Dimsdale. "She recognizes, believe me, the solemn miracle which God hath wrought in the existence of that child, and may she feel, too, what methinks is the very truth, that this boon was meant, above all things else, to keep the mother's soul alive, and to preserve her from blacker depths of sin into which Satan might else have sought to plunge her. Therefore, it is good for this poor sinful woman that she hath an infant immortality, a being capable of eternal joy or sorrow, confided to her care, to be trained up by her to righteousness, to remind her at every moment of her fall, and yet to teach her, as it were by the Creator's sacred pledge, that if she bring the child to heaven, the child also will bring its parent thither. Herein is the sinful mother happier than the sinful father. For Hester Prynne's sake, then, and no less for the poor child's sake, let us leave them as Providence hath seen fit to place them." All right, so he goes on where we left off. Governor Bellingham's like, "Well, what do you mean? Go ahead and explain what you mean." And so he does so. He says, God gave her the child, and if we separate them or take that away, isn't that like saying that God made a mistake? He says, it'd be like saying that God hath lightly recognized a deed of sin. Like, do you not think God knew what he was doing? That sort of thing. He also goes on to say that God gave her the child, and he gave her the child for a reason. And as Hester has said, he thinks it's in order to help Hester repent, like pay back her, for her, in order to, I can't think of the word right now, in order to keep her from sinning further. Because what else does Hester have? She has nothing. She has no family. As far as they're concerned, her husband's dead, which he may as well be. Um, she has no friends. So without Pearl, the woman would literally have nothing. So it's like Pearl's job is to kind of give Hester something to live for, something to focus on. And if Hester leads Pearl in the righteous path, right, the path to heaven, then she herself will stay on that path as well and get to heaven. Now, remember, the Puritans were very, 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 very religious. So this would be a pretty convincing point. You speak, my friend, with a strange earnestness, said old Roger Chillingworth, smiling at him. And there is a weighty import in what my young brother hath spoken, added the Reverend Mr. Wilson. What say you, worshipful Master Bellingham? Hath he not pleaded well for the poor woman? Indeed hath he, answered the magistrate, and hath adduced such arguments that we will even leave the matter as it now stands, so long at least as there shall be no further scandal in the woman. Care must be had, nevertheless, to put the child to due and stated examination in the catechism, at thy hands or Master Dimsdale's. Moreover, at a proper season, the tithing men must take heed that she go both to school and to meeting. So ultimately, Wilson says, you know what? Dimsdale made some good points. What do you think, Bellingham? And Bellingham says, okay, Hester can keep her as long as Hester doesn't get in any more trouble, as long as Wilson or Dimsdale check in and make sure Pearl is learning the religious things that she should be learning at this age. And later, when she's old enough, she has to go to church and she has to go to school on a regular basis. Now, it's talked about Hester going to church anyway, and obviously she would have had Pearl with her, but that's just one of the stipulations that he wants to make sure happens. The young minister, on ceasing to speak, had withdrawn a few steps from the group, and stood with his face partially concealed in the heavy folds of the window curtains, while the shadow of his figure, which the sunlight cast upon the floor, was tremulous with the vehemence of his appeal. And taking his hand, no, I lost my place, sorry. Pearl, that wild and flighty little elf, stole softly towards him, and taking his hand in the grasp of both her own, laid her cheek against it, a caress so tender and withal so unobtrusive that her mother, who was looking on, asked herself, is that my Pearl? Yet she knew that there was love in the child's heart, although it mostly revealed itself in passion, and hardly twice in her lifetime had been softened by such gentleness as now. The minister, for save the long-sought regards of woman, nothing is sweeter than these marks of childish preference accorded spontaneously by a spiritual instinct, and therefore seeming to imply in us something truly worthy to be loved. The minister looked round, laid his hand on the child's head, hesitated an instant, and then kissed her brow. Little Pearl's unwonted mood of sentiment lasted no longer. She laughed and went capering down the hall so airily that old Mr. Wilson raised a question whether even her tiptoes touched the floor. The little baggage hath witchcraft in her, I profess, said he to Mr. Dimsdale. She needs no old woman's broomstick to fly withal. All right, so what just happened? Because it's kind of a big deal. After the exchange, right, Dimsdale pleads on Hester's behalf and convinces Bellingham to let Pearl stay with Hester. And immediately after that, as Dimsdale's kind of standing in the background, not really in the background, but he's just standing there off to the side, Pearl runs up to him, takes his hand, because she's 3, right? So she's short, takes his hand, puts it against her cheek just for a moment. And Hester's watching thinking, is that Pearl? Like, is that really her? Because the kid's never nice to anybody. Why? Because no one's nice to her. Even earlier, it said with Reverend Wilson that when he tried to touch her, she took off. So it's like Pearl can sense that Dimsdale just did something nice for them. And so she has this very brief moment. Dimsdale pats her on the head and then kisses her forehead, and then just like that, off she goes again. And Wilson questions whether she's actually a little witch because it looks like she's almost floating, and it's mentioned that about Pearl before. A strange child, remarked old Roger Chillingworth. It is easy to see the mother's part in her. Would it be beyond a philosopher's research, think ye, gentlemen, to analyze that child's nature, and from its make and mold to give a shrewd guess at the father? Nay, it would be sinful in such a question to follow the clue of profane philosophy, said Mr. Wilson. Better to fast and pray upon it, and still better it may be to leave the mystery as we find it, unless Providence reveal it of its own accord. Thereby, every good Christian man hath a title to show a father's kindness towards the poor deserted babe. So Chillingworth's there, and remember Chillingworth earlier vowed to figure out who the father is, and so he uses this as an excellent opportunity to suggest what? Well, he suggests that it's really easy to see Hester in Pearl, and so he says maybe we should study her, take a closer look, and see if we can guess who her father is based on her behavior, her personality, her looks. Wilson says no, that would be sinful, that you need to just leave it alone and pray about it, and if God wants us to know, he'll reveal it. The affair being so satisfactorily concluded, Hester Prynne with Pearl departed from the house. As they descended the steps, it is averred that the lattice of a chamber window was thrown open, and forth into the sunny day was thrust the face of Mistress Hibbins, Governor Bellingham's bitter-tempered sister, and the same who, a few years later, was executed as a witch. All right, it mentioned Mistress Hibbins in an earlier chapter, and I told you to remember her name. So here she is again, and we find out a little bit more about her. Not only was she suspected as a witch, but she is also Governor Bellingham's sister. And oddly enough, as Hester and Pearl are leaving, Mistress Hibbins opens the window and pops her head out. Hist, hist, said she, while her ill-omened physiognomy seemed to cast a shadow over the cheerful newness of the house. Wilt thou go with us tonight? There will be a merry company in the forest, and I well nigh promised the black man that comely Hester Prynne should make one. Make my excuse to him, so please you, answered Hester with a triumphant smile. I must tarry at home and keep watch over my little Pearl. Had they taken her from me, I would willingly have gone with thee into the forest, and signed my name in the black man's book too, and that with mine own blood. We shall have thee there anon, said the witch lady, frowning, as she drew back her head. But here, if we suppose this interview betwixt Mistress Hibbins and Hester Prynne to be authentic, and not a parable, was already an illustration of the young minister's argument against sundering the relation of a fallen mother to the offspring of her frailty. Even thus early had the child saved her from Satan's snare. Okay, so this exchange with Mistress Hibbins is kind of crazy. Mistress Hibbins says, hey, you want to come with us to the forest tonight? I told the black man you'd be there. If you've not watched the earlier videos, or you've not, or maybe I haven't said it on the videos, but everything is a symbol in dark romanticism, and this is a couple of those examples. One thing is the forest. They believed that the forest was ruled by darkness, by the devil. And so witches and the devil and the wild Indian savages, they were all known to reside in the forest, right? The uncivilized portions of New England. So any reference to the forest probably has some sort of ties to something going on that wouldn't be accepted by the Puritan culture. While they believed that the civilized portion of the settlement, so being in town in Boston in this case, those areas would be ruled by God, that God is in control of those. So there's that. And then the reference to the black man, capital B, capital M, she's talking about the devil. and the book calls him the Black Man quite a bit. This, again, was very common of the time period. Dark romantic writers had a number of names for the devil. It was a pretty common motif in their writing. So the Black Man's the devil. So Mistress Hibbins says, hey, Hester, you want to come with me to the forest tonight? We're going to have a party with the devil. I told him you were coming. I told him I'd bring you. Hester says no. Why? Because she says, I have to take care of Pearl. If they had taken her from me, I would gladly go with you, and I'd sign my name in his book too. So if you're not familiar with the reference to putting your name in the devil's book, if you make a deal with the devil, you sign his book, usually in your blood. That's that reference. And of course, in exchange, he gives you whatever it is the terms of the deal are, and then he gets your soul when it's time or when he decides to take it. And she says if they had taken Pearl away, she would have gone with Mistress Hibbins. So that last paragraph in the chapter is the narrator pointing out that already Pearl has saved her mother from making a deal with the devil. All right, quick summary of chapter 8. Reverend Wilson questioned Pearl to see if she knew the things that a child her age should know about religion. And even though she's been taught these things, Pearl refuses to cooperate. She gives the wrong answer. Now, realistically, the fact that she's a toddler probably plays a huge role in that, but Hester might have felt like there was more to it. She always feels like Pearl knows just what to do to upset her. Bellingham and Wilson then say again that Pearl needs to be taken away to be raised by someone who is better apt. Hester demands or insists that not happen. She asks Dimmesdale for help. Dimmesdale ends up suggesting that Hester is really the best suited because God gave her the child, and therefore he gave Hester the ability or the knowledge to take care of her. He says that separating them would be like saying that God made a mistake, and that Pearl helps keep Hester on the path to righteousness, which of course would be pretty convincing at this time period. Pearl responds in this surprisingly affectionate manner and it makes Hester pretty proud. So that's that episode where she goes and she puts Dimmesdale's hand on her cheek. And then at the end, we have the exchange with Mistress Hibbins, which we find out is the governor's sister and a suspected witch. And Hester turns down her invitation thanks to the fact that she has Pearl to take care of. I hope this clears up any questions that you might have for Chapter 8.